Welcome back. Germany's second largest city, Hamburg, is hosting the G20 summit starting tomorrow. As world leaders land, protesters have also converged. On Gravitas, we look beyond the headlines. What's G20 really meant to do? How relevant is it in today's context? But first, a quick look at what's expected.
Hamburg is all set to host the two-day summit of G20 countries, a key international economic cooperation and participation summit. The host has already signaled that climate change, free trade and global migration will be some of the priorities that would be discussed in the multi-nation meet. But there could be some impediments to reaching a broad consensus on these issues. The 12th G20 summit will be the first for American President Donald Trump, and the member nations will have to deal with drastically different American policies following a change of guard. The summit could witness a replay of Trump's decision to resist pressure to sign up to joint positions on issues such as climate change, trade and migration during the G7 summit earlier this year. And with Britain all set to leave the European Union, the 20-nation bloc will try to carefully realign its policies so that they are relevant in the changing global order. The host nation itself is in a bit of a bind, with surging unemployment, dearth of investments and huge budget imbalance marring the German economic scenario. The summit is being viewed by pundits as an attempt by Merkel to ascertain her political dominance on international forum ahead of federal elections in September. Germany has also stoked a row by banning Turkey's President Erdogan from addressing a rally. The latest flashpoint, with Erdogan calling the order a Nazi practice, could add to heightened tension during the summit. And it is not just nations at loggerheads which could hamper the success of the summit. A rally of protesters hit the suburbs against the summit, forcing German police to implement a no-protest zone in a 38-kilometer radius around the venue. Amid the numerous challenges that the summit faces, it remains to be seen if the vision of this year's summit to shape an interconnected world will bear its fruit. Bureau Report, WION.
Joining us this evening on Gravitas, Dr. Markus Pindur, federal correspondent of Deutschland Radio, with us from Berlin. Glenn Carl, American writer, former CIA official, with us from Massachusetts. Good evening to both of you. Dr. Pindur, let me start with you, and let's start with the protests and the security arrangements. Is Hamburg ready for the G20?
I would think so. There's been so many things that have been done. Even the big river Elbe has been cordoned off to not to let anyone pass. Hamburg is a port city, so that does mean a lot. A lot of the inner city is cordoned off to the public. It's not 38 kilometers, but it's a considerable area. And you must imagine, I mean, there are 20 of the most important statesmen in the world in Hamburg, and the security is tight.
I can imagine. Glenn Carl, we're looking at the agenda, we're looking at the preparations, but we're also wondering, what is this summit really about? What do these summits really achieve? Are they even relevant?
Well, I think they are relevant, but summits do receive in a number of ways, whether it's a large one like this with 20 heads of state, or a bilateral, say, between the United States and Russia, or India and China, often I think receive more characterizations for substantive import than they deserve. They're very choreographed and set piece meetings. It's highly unusual for heads of state to sit down and actually to negotiate anything. This sets down markers, and you formalize work of bureaucrats and officials, because nothing should be done on the fly, which is one of the alarming things. There are so many about Donald Trump's announcement about his intended meeting with Putin, for example. He claims to have no agenda. If you have no agenda, the other party sets the agenda, and you automatically have lost half of the debate. So they're set pieces. They are significant, but there's less negotiating than one generally imagines.
Right. Dr. Pindur, a lot of balancing acts will also have to be performed given the guest list. It's an interesting mix, to say the least.
It is an interesting mix, one might say. I mean, it's an interesting mix of countries that is represented here. I mean, from Australia to China, India,
Turkey.
Turkey, couple of European countries, plus the United States. And then there comes the big unknown, and that is the United States and President Donald Trump, who is not known to like multilateral negotiations, multilateral conferences, who is trying to leverage the whole firepower, so to speak, of the United States one-on-one. He had just visited Poland yesterday, and that was, I think, quite more to his liking, because there he was the sole center of attraction and importance, and he made a deal with the Polish government about Patriot missiles. That's more to his liking than a multilateral summit. But the German Chancellor, Ms. Merkel, is posing a lot of energy and a lot of pressure into that summit. There are a couple of initiatives concerning free trade that is on top of the agenda of the German government, given the current lookout of the American government, who seems to be rather skeptical about free trade. There is an initiative concerning migration and poverty in Africa. It's a big Africa initiative that will try to leverage assistance and aid to a couple of African countries who try to fulfill norms of good governance. Plus, there's the matter of climate change, which is very high on the agenda of the German government, very low on the agenda of the Americans.
Right. Glenn, Turkish President Erdogan is also going to be visiting, and just before the visit he said that Germany is committing, quote-unquote, committing suicide by not letting him meet Turks in Germany. The point I'm trying to make is that this sounds like a party of big boys who keep fighting but who are not going to miss the party either.
Well, I suppose that's an accurate characterization. If you are not present, the French say les absents ont toujours tort, which means if you are not there, you lose. You will always be in the wrong. So you have to show up, but the positioning, our colleague in Hamburg, I think, characterized this well, and it speaks to my larger point that these are tectonic positionings or chess moves that then are sort of sanctified, to mix all sorts of metaphors, by the meetings themselves. So Erdogan will want to show up. He's a strong man. He'll want to. His presence will pressure Merkel and Europe, even if he doesn't get what he wants. While Merkel, having stated the agenda simply and affirming it by the meetings, as we just heard from our colleague, will also advance the agenda. That's the substance that occurs, rather than Merkel sitting beside Trump and talking about tea or stolen elections or something. It is consequential. Position is and appearance, impressions become reality. That's what these summits do.
Right. Do stay with us, both of you. The summit is more interesting for really what happens on the sidelines, more so because the ever controversial American president is also participating. Listen into this first.
100 years after the entry of American forces into World War I, the transatlantic bond between the United States and Europe is as strong as ever, and maybe in many ways even stronger. This continent no longer confronts the specter of communism. But today we're in the West, and we have to say there are dire threats to our security and to our way of life. You see what's happening out there. They are threats. We will confront them. We will win. But they are threats.
This is the same man who described NATO as obsolete, demanded that NATO members pay for their security, and trashed his allies, accusing some of them of running huge trade surpluses with the US. In that sense, the G20 summit in Hamburg could well mark the coming of age of Donald Trump, perhaps forced to succumb to the pressures from the deep state back home over his attempt to overturn traditional foreign policy positions. How else does one make sense of his views on Russia? The same man accused of cozying up to Russia and endangering American national security was on an anti-Russia tirade over the past few days.
We urge Russia to cease its destabilizing activities in Ukraine and elsewhere, and its support for hostile regimes, including Syria and Iran, and to instead join the community of responsible nations in our fight against common enemies and in defense of civilization itself.
Well, Trump even named Russia as one among other countries meddling in America's internal affairs.
I agree. I think it was Russia, but I think it was probably other people and/or countries, and I see nothing wrong with that statement. Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows for sure.
I doubt many people know what he's trying to say. But coming ahead of his meeting with Russia's President Vladimir Putin tomorrow, Trump's remarks are hardly calculated to inspire confidence in the success of that meeting, or that the two leaders could work together on a range of world issues, including the conflict in Syria. On North Korea, there's even less likelihood of anything tangible emerging. Trump has accused China of not doing enough to get the North to curb its saber-rattling and missile testing.
It's a shame that they're behaving this way, but they are behaving in a very, very dangerous manner, and something will have to be done about it.
North Korea's launch of an ICBM, or an intercontinental ballistic missile, on Tuesday has cast a shadow over Trump's meeting with China's President Xi Jinping. China's trade surplus with the US is another grouse, and Trump has already announced a slew of measures against Beijing. The administration has approved a $1.4 billion arms sale to Taiwan, declared sanctions against a Chinese bank accused of funneling illegal North Korean financial activity, and sent a US naval destroyer near a disputed island chain in the South China Sea claimed by Beijing. There are hints being thrown of Chinese steel exports to the US being identified for levying higher tariffs, of other sanctions against countries seen as aiding North Korea. But China does not like being pushed, and it's pretty clear that both Putin and Xi Jinping intend to join hands to checkmate the US. And on that note, let me come to you, Glenn Carl. This is not where it ends. Fiona Hill, the White House's best-known Russia hawk, is already in Germany, and Trump's aides, I understand, want him to be present in the meeting with Vladimir Putin. Where do you see this going? Which way?
Well, Fiona and I worked together. We were colleagues years ago. I think very highly of her, and she's a rare voice of competence, knowledge, reason, and focus in what passes for the American government now. But I think we have to frame this in a larger sense than all media have, and almost all pundits have. It's true, as you reported, that Trump has said things that sound affirmations of NATO American positions with respect to Russia in Ukraine or elsewhere in Syria. However, these are easy sops to the pundits and to the experts, and give the appearance of continuity, when the larger structural changes have also been affirmed and are continuing. Those are the bigger facts, which is that Trump continues fundamentally to undermine the multilateral approach of the United States since World War II, and to define, accept fundamentally a sphere of influence, more isolationist kind of and unilateral American and policies by other countries. So with regard to Syria, I think it's a perfect comparison. The U.S. did bomb this airfield of Assad's government, but it was meaningless, really. It was a marker because it showed apparently toughness. In fact, we had notified the Syrians in advance so they could remove anyone who was going to be killed. We notified the Russians in advance. Meanwhile, we have conceded that Assad will remain in power, and ceded the future of Syria's post-ISIS structure to Russia. Explicitly so. Secretary of State has explicitly done that. So the larger changes continue while Trump gets the cover now of having said nice but fundamentally empty things.
Right, Dr. Pindur, I'm sorry, given Nikki Haley's statements yesterday, where she accused Russia and China of literally holding Kim's hand, chiding them of not supporting America's effort to hold Pyongyang responsible, these meetings are going to be in focus and going to be very difficult to conduct at the same time.
I bet they are. And I would think that his opponents, namely Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi, really know how difficult Donald Trump to deal with is. And the problem with Donald Trump, having been a correspondent to Washington for quite a long time, the problem with Donald Trump is that a lot of times he's just playing to his domestic audience. We really do not know when he's trying to conduct genuine foreign policy or when he's trying to play to a domestic audience. That's a big problem. He cannot appear as being too cozy to the Russians because he's under big domestic pressure because of his Russia connection, as it is called right now. So, yes, there's going to be a lot of tension, and there's not going to be a lot of cooperation among the three of them. But let me remind you of another fact concerning trade, which is very high on the agenda of this summit. The EU and Japan, which account for a third of global GSP, are having a trade agreement and signing a trade agreement before this summit is over. That is a strong signal to Donald Trump and also to Xi and Putin.
All right, Marcus Pindur, Glenn Carl, thanks very much for joining us. We are going to be reporting out of Hamburg. My colleague Padma Rao is landing there later this evening, and we'll be bringing you the very latest from the summit. But from the high and positive note struck in Israel, Prime Minister Narendra Modi too is on his way to Hamburg, and that G20 schedule looks less positive. To be sure, he will be rubbing shoulders with some of the world's most powerful leaders, but the standoff with China in the high Himalayas could cast a shadow over any chit-chat with President Xi Jinping. No bilateral has been scheduled. In fact, the Hamburg event is a purely multilateral event comprising the G20 and the BRICS. So when Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa and China get together for a talk on taking the grouping forward, there may be space for a pull aside where Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping could exchange ideas, maybe even agree to a quiet de-escalation after the heat settles. The pundits say that India is probably has not behaved as the Chinese may have expected it to. India sent troops to reinforce the positions of the Royal Bhutan Army on the Doklam Plateau. The only public reaction was a detailed statement from the External Affairs Ministry. There was also a short comment from the Defence Ministry. The Army Chief visited Sikkim but made no comments. On the other hand, there's been a stream of commentary and criticism of India from Beijing. There have been warnings from the government-controlled Chinese media, including allusions to India's defeat in 1962 and dismissal of India's security concerns.
并不明白印方所谓的中国的修路行动给印方带来严重安全风险的依据是什么？中方在自己的领土上修路，这是主权国家的正当行为，合理。
Some of the Chinese criticism has been shrill, accusatory, disregarding the fact that India has every right to build infrastructure on its own territory.
有的地方甚至旗县、越县修建碉堡等军事设施，不断地改变边界地区的现状。我不知道印方在这么做的时候有没有考虑到中方的安全关切。
So quiet de-escalation may be in China's best interest. The National People's Congress opens in October and Xi Jinping will be looking at enhancing his stature and power. Anything which reflects negatively will give ammunition to his adversaries to target him. A conversation with Modi could resolve the Himalayan standoff. The big question is, will that happen? Joining me in the studio here is Professor Swaran Singh, a professor at the School of International Studies at JNU and somebody who understands the India-China situation very well. Also, Einar Tangen, political and economic commentator, joining us from Beijing. Good evening to both of you. Professor Singh, let me ask you the question that I thought aloud. Are the two leaders going to be meeting?
Surely, there are several occasions listed, both as part of G20 and then of course as the side meeting of BRICS countries where the two leaders will be meeting. So to the least we can expect some smiling photos together. Whether they'll go beyond that is very doubtful, because the kind of messages that one is hearing from Beijing, from media, from officials, it doesn't look like China is in a mood to allow any dialogue at this stage, because they are putting preconditions, which is very unusual. So it doesn't look like any breakthrough, even ice breaking is likely to happen in this meeting. But maybe a signal of two leaders smiling together could at least cool down tempers very slightly. And in the long run, maybe, some kind of dialogue might start, but nothing in a hurry. And I must add that, the more it drags, it's not good for either side, but particularly not good for India, because there is likelihood of Bhutan beginning to feel the pinch, that two leaders, two great powers are beginning to sort of rub shoulders with each other, and Bhutan is going to suffer out of it. So I think it is in India's interest, and that is how you notice the language in India is one of dialogue repeatedly. And I think not just with Chinese, but India should also begin to coordinate with all other neighbors of China, because India today is the largest neighbor of China. And China perhaps have a sense that if they could browbeat India, that would send a good message, according to them, for all other neighbors.
Right.
So in that sense, I think India also therefore stands, there's a certain responsibility that India bears.
China wants to establish itself as the first among equals.
Exactly.
And when the two leaders meet, I hope they're not reading media headlines, because the press on either side is saying that the others wanted to talk and we've rejected the request, and that is the narrative that is playing out. But Einar, let me ask you this. Is there sincerity in China's effort to resolve? Because as Professor Swaran Singh said, when you publicly put preconditions on resolution of a dispute, you make it very, very difficult to resolve.
On the other hand, the presence of foreign troops on what you believe is soil is almost unbearable for the Chinese perspective. They see here is quite different. When Marshal Bipin says that he's preparing for a 2.5-year war with China, that is seen as provocative. So there's provocation on both sides. The question is how you ratchet it down. China has said unilaterally there will be no negotiations until Indian soldiers are off what they claim is their territory. I don't know that that is unreasonable, given the circumstances. It is not a situation where this is Indian territory. It is simply intercession by India on behalf of another country.
That is what China has been saying, that India is misleading.
That's true, but the
in
point...
1893,
there was an agreement.
agreement.
There was an agreement of 1998 between Bhutan and China, which clearly says that neither side will do any such thing which will alter the status quo that existed before 1959. So such an extension of building a road and coming all the way to the Doklam plateau is clearly an indication that China is trying to alter the status quo. And this is not the only example, there is a pattern to it. Chinese are trying to alter several status quos in entire neighborhood. So it's part of that pattern that we read it in that sense. And Indian forces in Bhutan is not reaching there yesterday, they've been there all the time, always. We have a special relationship with Bhutan, and in that sense Indian forces are always there. And as I said, idly speaking, no preconditions should be there. But in case someone has to withdraw, then let us assume the forces that breached that understanding should withdraw first. And it is obvious that Bhutan claims sovereignty on that territory, and Chinese forces first entered that territory. Maybe Chinese forces will then withdraw first, and there will be reciprocation from other Bhutanese and Indian side as well, I suppose. But as I'm saying, no preconditions is an ideal way of starting a dialogue, because there's a dispute, there's a conflict, you want to solve it through dialogue. please, no preconditions from either side.
Right, and China, it seems, believes that it's destined to lead Asia, which is what gives it confidence. But it's trying to draw India, Einar, as we see it from here, into a conflict, and it not only exposes the fault lines, the geopolitical fault lines in the region, but the fact that the 1962 reference was made, the fact that the Chinese state-owned media is saying India should be taught a lesson, is provocation. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, it is provocative. Of course, there's no provocative action on behalf of India. The fact that you have many people calling for war, teach China a lesson. This is not 1962. Prepare for a 2.5-year war. This is not provocation. I think on both sides, the rhetoric needs to be ratcheted down. In terms of the treaty that was mentioned by my esteemed colleague, don't forget, in that same treaty, they said that any arguments should be not through military force, but by sitting down prior to an incident and negotiating all the differences. Obviously, that was not taken. So at this point, I think insisting that somehow it is okay for Indian troops to be present when this should be not the case is silly. It's very clear. Withdraw the Indian troops, get down to the negotiating table, make sure that everybody is very clear on what the issues are and how to solve them. This cannot continue the way it is without bloodshed. And this is my concern.
Do you fear this is escalating, or this is going to escalate into a military conflict? It's been 3 weeks already.
I think it's partly the compulsions that President Xi Jinping has at home, which are first of all political. As you mentioned, the National People's Congress is meeting. They have to present the work report there as to what has he achieved in the last 5 years. He's going to enter his second term. People's Liberation Army is having 90th anniversary. Hong Kong is having 20th anniversary. So there are domestic political considerations. Then, of course, economic considerations. That China sees Xi Jinping trying to build BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, as his legacy. And you remember, Bhutan, along with India, did not join in. So there's a problem there. And I think there's an intention, apparently, here to cast a wedge between India and Bhutan, which is a very special relationship, and maybe then find some way of solving the problem vis-a-vis Bhutan by either giving some incentives. Fundamentally, Chinese want to expand the width of Chumbi Valley. They feel squeezed between Sikkim of India and Bhutan. And therefore, they have their security concerns. And they want to make sure that if they can get Bhutan out of the special relationship with India, they will be perhaps able to solve the problems much better by either incentivizing or in some ways coercing Bhutan into some kind of an understanding. India would stand with Bhutan all the time, as we have done before. I want to repeat again, Indian forces being there is nothing new. So I don't think there should be an issue that as to why Indian forces are in Bhutan. That's a special relationship we have maintained all these years. So I think it doesn't look like Chinese are in a position right now to really move forward in seeking a solution. It doesn't suit them domestically, whether it is from political compulsions or economic compulsions or strategic compulsions. Maybe India will have to keep pushing for it, and we'll have to find some way where we can start a dialogue between the two states.
Right. We'll see what happens over the weekend when the two leaders meet in Hamburg. And interestingly, Prime Minister Modi in Russia earlier this year said that not a single bullet has been fired in 40 years between India and China, despite the border tensions. Maybe jinxed it, who knows. Swaran Singh and Einar Tangan, thanks very much for joining us here on Gravitas.